দাঁড়ান।
স্টার্ট করবো প্রলয়?
হ্যাঁ।
ওকে, ঠিক আছে। So we are starting, Roby. Okay. শুভ সন্ধ্যা সবাইকে। Good evening everyone, and a very good morning to our guest of honor, our speaker, Professor ROBY RAJAN. গড়বেতা কলেজের অর্থনীতি বিভাগ এবং ভূগোল বিভাগের পক্ষ থেকে সকলকে স্বাগত জানাই আজকের এই আন্তর্জাতিক ওয়েব সেমিনারে।
I think Arpita, somebody needs to mute their mic.
Yes, now we are good. Yes. On behalf of the Department of Economics and the Department of Geography of Garhbeta College, we welcome you all to this international web seminar. We thank each and every participant, all our colleagues from Garhbeta College, as well as from all other colleges, universities and organizations, and all our students for joining us this evening. We are immensely delighted and excited to have Professor ROBY RAJAN, University of Wisconsin Parkside, USA, who has graciously agreed to speak at today's web seminar. We will start today's program now, before which I would like to gently remind you all to please keep your microphones off. আমাদের প্রিয় ছাত্রছাত্রীদেরও মনে করিয়ে দিই তোমরা প্রত্যেকে মাইকটা অফ রাখবে। It is our pleasure to have our respected principal sir among ourselves. Our honorable principal, Professor Dr. Hari Prasad Sarkar, has always been a strong pillar of support and encouragement for all our academic endeavors. Sir, we are very happy that you have joined us, and we would request you to kindly inaugurate today's web seminar. Sir.
Okay, thank you. Am I audible, please?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Very good morning, Professor Rajan, and good evening to all of you, other participants and other guests. Welcome to all in the one-day international webinar on the topic Homo sapiens as pathogens, humans, the environment, and disaster, organized jointly by the Department of Geography and the Department of Economics of Garhbeta College. At the very outset, I take the opportunity to offer a hearty welcome to our honorable speaker, Professor ROBY RAJAN, Department of Business, University of Wisconsin, Parkside, USA. I am very much thankful to the honorable speaker for sparing his most valuable time with us in spite of his very busy schedule. I pay my heartfelt thanks to all the members of the organizing committee, especially Mr. Uttam Sarkar, Assistant Professor and Head, Department of Geography, and Dr. Garhbeta Banerjee, Assistant Professor, Department of Economics, as joint conveners of this webinar, and also Dr. Pritish Kumar Hait, Associate Professor and Head, Department of Economics, Mr. Kunal Misro, Department of Economics, Mr. Uttam Bhuya, Mr. Bhanu Kumar Mondal, Dr. Asit Kumar Jana, Mrs. Aditi Ghosh, and Mr. Tanmay Ghosh of Department of Geography for organizing this international webinar for the academic interest of the students, teachers, and for the society in this COVID-19 pandemic situation. I am very much thankful to Dr. Rajlakshmi Mukherjee, TCS and Assistant Professor, Department of Economics, and Mr. Pralay Bhattacharya, Librarian, for that technical support in the webinar. My hearty welcome to all other faculty members and staff of Garhbeta College, distinguished guests, participants, ladies and gentlemen. Our esteemed college, Garhbeta College, is one of the oldest college in the undivided Midnapur district in the post-independence period established on 13th August 1948. The college is now upgraded as an ideal place of education in a very beautiful location having its large area with its own scenic beauty in the bank of river Shilavati. At present, the college is a multidisciplinary degree college running with 14 different undergraduate courses, 20 different general courses, and 2 professional courses, BPA and BCA, and 1 major course, and also 4 postgraduate courses like mathematics, Bengali history, and geology. Though we are facing some serious troubles in the teaching learning process due to COVID-19 pandemic restriction since the end of March 2020, but the college authority is trying to compensate the deficiency as much as possible using some alternative methods as per guidelines of UGC, state government, and Vidyasagar University. The arrangement of this international webinar is also a part of our continuous academic activities in this pandemic situation. In a growth-frenzy world, caring about ecological footprint is not that fashionable to a large group of mainstream policymakers. Prevalence of abject poverty among large sections of our species across the continent is often cited by them as an excuse for that not caring. Though amazing, the lion's share of wealth created by using nature's gift by a handful of people is not that big deal to them. Hence, we may take away the future wealth, thus we'll have command over the future commodities which would be produced by not carrying ecological or carbon footprints is not that ambiguous. Thanks to Limits to Growth report in 1972, a movement has developed to focus at least some light on the concept of sustainable development. So, at least some discussion is on regarding irreparable damage that has been or is being unleashed by us on nature. Destruction of nature and its effect on future production, nature's possible rate of regeneration, cost of restriction, nature's damage, cost of nature-friendly technology, all are being taken into consideration by economists to solve optimization problem or for cost-benefit analysis to find a possible solution. Subsequently, William Nordhaus has been awarded avant-garde Sapiens Risk Bank Prizes, popularly known as Nobel Prize, in Economic Sciences by the Royal Swedish Academy of Science technically for integrating climate change into long-run macroeconomic analysis, or basically for providing a market solution to the climate change. However, the premises on which this theory stands is highly controversial. Some argue that enough care has not been taken on tipping points. Some also argue that it is quite foolish to consider a market solution now to restrict the damage as the extent of damage that has already been inflicted by us in severe in nature. Therefore, in all respect, the role of our species should be seriously scrutinized. I hope that with the scientific discussions of today's erudite speaker, we'll find more knowledge on the theme Homo sapiens as a pathogens, humans, the environment, and disaster. I also, at last, I also congratulate all the members of the college, Garhbeta College, and also I wish this webinar a grand success. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you for your words. It is time now to start today's session. I take immense pride in introducing you all to our speaker, Professor ROBY RAJAN. ROBY RAJAN is a professor in the Department of Business at the University of Wisconsin Parkside. He has a BS in Mechanical Engineering from the Birla Institute of Technology and Science, Pilani, an MA in Economics from Virginia Tech, and a PhD in Industrial Engineering and Operations Research from Virginia Tech. He has research interests spanning multiple disciplines and has published in a variety of journals, including operations research, the International Economic Review, the Cato Journal, empirical economics, alternatives, emergences, rethinking Marxism, futures, third world resurgence, humanscape, the International Journal of Knowledge, Culture and Change Management, and Knowledge Management and International Journal, to name a few. He is a founding member of Kochi-based Backwaters Collective on Metaphysics and Politics, under whose auspices he has co-edited with Vinay Lal the volume India and the Unthinkable, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2016. He has contributed chapters to a number of other edited volumes, most recently to the Backwaters Collective's India and Civilizational Futures, which was again published by Oxford University Press in 2019. His latest paper on disaster management, sustainability and globalization has just appeared in the International Journal of Interdisciplinary Global Studies. Professor Rajan, we are extremely happy to have you today. I will now hand it over to you, ROBY, before which I would just let you all know, let all the participants know that ROBY will speak for about an hour, and after that he will take all your questions. Is that all right, ROBY?
Yeah.
Okay. I would request all our participants to please write your questions in the chat box along with your name. Okay, the platform is all yours now, ROBY.
Thank you very much, Garhbeta, and thank you once again, Dr. Sarkar and Dr. Banerjee, for your kind invitation to share my thoughts with you, and thank you to all the participants for coming into the seminar. I hope we can have an open discussion. I mean, the topic itself is, of course, highly complex, and it spans multiple disciplines, but I've sort of tied some ideas together from different disciplines, and I don't claim that that's in any way definitive. So in the course of my talk, I'll throw open some questions, and perhaps we can think about some of these things together, jointly. So that's the spirit in which I'm approaching this topic. Okay, so I've titled the presentation somewhat provocatively, Homo sapiens as pathogen. Usually we think of pathogens as viruses, bacteria, and so forth that attack us. But I want to reverse the perspective here a little bit and ask, well, are we ourselves a kind of pathogen for other species and for the planet? And so I want to tie in the idea of humans, environment, and what we are increasingly calling disaster. So just a brief outline. So I want to begin with the idea of disaster, and especially the idea that the time lag between cause and effect of disasters can far exceed the average lifespan of an individual. So in other words, the time frame of an individual human life is no longer adequate for us to reflect on what exactly a disaster is. And it can only be measured now in geological time, and there are some concepts that I'll begin to introduce which try to locate our lifespan, especially the span of our industrial civilization, within a much, much broader time span, and in particular geological time. So we'll begin with that. Professor Sarkar mentioned the idea of sustainability, sustainable development, and so forth. I want to do a quick review of some of those attempts to measure sustainability in some disciplines, especially in economics, but also related disciplines. And I want to argue that the way sustainability has been tackled is really not adequate or doesn't rise to the demands of our current planetary state. And so I want to take a step back from sustainability and see whether we can approach it some other way. Then I want to do a quick review of globalization, which we usually think of as the transnational movement of goods and services. But I think concurrent with that development, there are lots of other transformations that are happening, and we need to include those also under the umbrella of globalization. That is to say, if we restrict it just to the economic dimension, I think we're missing a lot of the other side effects that economic globalization also has. Then I want to come to the idea of concepts. And what I mean by that is that typically we approach global warming as an institutional problem, that we have to have, the right institutions in place, maybe cut back on economic growth a little bit, or bring some other transnational kind of organization. But I want to point more towards the inadequacy of the concepts that we have that justify their function. Right? So I'll just do a quick review of what those concepts are and why they're inadequate, and what might an alternative approach look like. Right? Can we reach for some other concepts that might be more adequate to the gravity of the crisis that we're facing? And finally, there's always a practical question that is, the moment you propose some alternative concepts, people are asking always, is it practical? Is it governable? So I want to also touch upon some of the practical aspects and said that, yes, if we move away from our present institutions and open our minds up to perhaps other approaches, there's no reason why it should not be practical. So that's sort of the broad outline. As I mentioned, some of these disasters are unfolding on a much, much vaster time scale than we can comprehend in terms of an individual human life. And there's an international organization called the International Commission on Stratigraphy, which is responsible for naming different geological ages. So our most proximate age prior to the age that we live in is called the Holocene, where we saw the melting of the ice and the ice from the previous ice age, which of course had tremendous influence and effects on the Earth's surface, on life forms and so forth. So we had the Pleistocene, which is the name for the ice age, the Holocene. And the Holocene was relatively stable. But now, as we all know now increasingly, that it's been disrupted by what's called the Great Acceleration. That is, the changes are no longer linear anymore, they're exponential. So they're cascading changes which have been set in motion. And we know that there are flash floods, storms, droughts, and so forth. And so there's a proposal before the ICS to name the current age as Anthropocene. And this is proposed by the chemist Paul Crutzen. And this basically is to suggest, the anthro, of course, means human, that human beings have had an irreversible effect on the planet. And so that era we're living in the midst of, it can no longer be understood purely in terms of natural changes or purely geological changes, because the effect of human activity has been so drastic. So that's the proposal to name it Anthropocene. And what's new about it? As I mentioned, anthropos, or humanity, is no longer just a biological presence, but has become a geological force, by which we just mean that human activity has simply altered the composition of the Earth's surface. And so it's not an exaggeration to say that in addition to the Pleistocene and the Holocene, the Anthropocene is the era of geological time where human beings themselves have become a geological force. Now, this has very significant implications for how humans interact with nature, because we've always assumed that nature is always in the backdrop, right? It's just this big reservoir that can simply absorb the byproducts and effluents of all our activity. And we stand away from that nature, and we're just sort of working on and interacting with nature. But the idea of the Anthropocene is that humans have themselves become a force of nature. And so how then, if they're affecting the balance of life on Earth, then how does that change the way we live, the way we think, our everyday lives, and so forth? So in short, what the Anthropocene wants to capture is that the distinction between nature and human history, that clear boundary that we had about human beings acting on nature, which by and large remains unchanged, that's no longer true, because human activity has disturbed the parametric conditions needed for their own survival, right? Such as the temperature zone within which the planet exists. Human activity has, in fact, seriously altered that through industrial expansion. So this is a distinction that is collapsing before our very eyes, this distinction between nature and human history. So one of the questions I want to raise towards the end is, how then do we come to terms with this in our everyday knowledge projects, in teaching? How does it affect the different disciplines and so forth? So related to this is the idea of disaster. The word disaster has been, of course, around in the English language, but we find now that that word is being used in much greater frequency because of all the disasters around us. And I was telling Professor Banerjee that when we were arranging for this lecture, that that evening I was watching the evening news, and practically every news item had to do with some disaster or other. You know, it's wildfires in California, it's hurricanes in Louisiana, flooding in New York, and so on and so forth. So this has become sort of an everyday affair. Disasters are no longer things that occur once in a great while. It's something that's at our doorstep, and we are having to confront it practically every day. So one of the things that's also happened because of that is that this, just as the boundary between humanity and nature has been blurred, so also the distinction between natural disaster and what we used to call man-made disaster, that's also been blurred, because many of the natural disasters are eventually man-made. They appear to be natural, but when you dig into the causes, it turns out that things like deforestation and building dams and so forth, which then lead to various floods, droughts, etc., ultimately turn out to be man-made. So that distinction doesn't really hold anymore. And so now we have a whole field of called disaster management, which studies, and there are actually textbooks on this field, which study how to cope with disaster, how to avoid disaster, mostly how to respond to disasters once they occur. Now, one of the reasons why this has attracted attention is because of the economic losses. So worldwide, premiums have really increased, insurance premiums. Between 2016 and 2018, there was an average of 15 climate-related disaster events, each causing over $1 billion damage, and so on. So because of the huge economic losses that these disasters have been inflicting, I think it's drawn attention to the underlying causes of these disasters. Now, the disaster projections, and I just put together a list of a few projections, but in fact, the entire list is far more depressing and dispiriting. But let's just go through a few of these. 2019 was the second hottest year in recorded history. And the July of this year actually was the hottest ever year that's been recorded in the US. So we know in India there have been floods, in China, Japan, wildfires in Australia, practically everywhere. And the majority of the deaths are in the world's poorest regions, India and Africa. And the predictions of climate refugees by the year 2050 range from 200 million to 1 billion. The numbers are staggering because what they're saying is that because of climate and extreme events and flooding and so forth and drought, people are going to be forced to uproot themselves and move to places where they think their survival chances are better. Now, the Paris Climate Accords recognize that the catastrophe threshold is 2 degrees. 1.5 is what they want to keep it at, that is 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Once you hit 2 degrees, and Professor Shorkar referred to it as a tipping point, right? At that point, things might spin out of control, and then it's going to be much more difficult to rein in the consequences of global warming. So at 2 degrees, you can see some of the things that might start to happen. Ice sheets will collapse, 400 million people will suffer water scarcity, and so on and so forth. What we in India often don't recognize is that India is expected to be the most hard-hit country. Because of its particular geography and location, its dependence on the monsoons and so forth, projections are that 800 million people will slip into extreme poverty, and that it'll suffer 32 times as many extreme heat waves, exposing 93 times more people. So India, it just so happens, is one of the most vulnerable regions. South Asia in general is one of the most vulnerable regions. And so we really have to find some way to make an urgent response. Even if all the Paris Accords were implemented, it turns out that that would still be beyond the tipping point. And what makes it so scary is that these effects are cascading, not discrete. Not that it happens once and then, what we used to call once in 100-year storm. Well, that's not the case anymore, right? It's happening much more frequently. And as I mentioned, it's not happening linearly, it's happening exponentially. So it's a little like the coronavirus, once it starts spreading, the graph becomes exponential. And the longer you wait, the more it spins out of control. So as a planet, we really are at a crisis point. Now, the concept that we've been using to come to grips with this crisis is sustainability. And I'm just putting a broad definition of sustainability. Sustainability, we ultimately mean that we want to safeguard the well-being of future generations. And that well-being depends on the stock of resources passed on to them. I want to argue, as you'll see later on, that when I say resources, I'm not only talking about natural resources or physical capital, but various other kinds of intangibles that are also rapidly being depleted. And it's also not just the quantity of resources, but the quality of the resources that we're handing out to future generations. Now, there are two measures, and I'll quickly go over it because these are basically definitional things. There are two types of measures of sustainability: economic measures and physical measures. The economic measures usually are country-based, You take the GDP number and then deduct from it the costs of water pollution, air pollution, loss of wetlands, farmlands, and so forth, and the effect of CO2 emissions. So that's you can work with the GDP number and come up with a green GDP, which takes into account all of these other environmental losses. Or you have something called the adjusted net savings. That is, what is the accumulated savings after you subtract away all of your consumption and resource rents, pollution damages, and so forth. Now, in this formula, you can also add the investments you're making. So the current expenditure on education, that can be added as a positive. But these measures are essentially working with existing economic concepts. Now, what are some drawbacks of these economic measures? Something like the green GDP, it does capture information about yearly consumption net of degradation. So that's its main advantage, that it subtracts away all the environmental degradation. But it doesn't tell us really anything about whether the consumption path is sustainable in future. If we keep doing this, are we getting nearer and nearer to the abyss? Is that adequate? It doesn't say anything. Also, economic measures eventually rely on some form of valuation, and the valuation measure that they're most fond of, economists, are prices. And of course, prices send correct signals through supply, demand, and so forth in very restricted circumstances. But the moment you introduce intergenerational scarcity, then the question is, how do you take into account the preferences of future generations? There isn't a price mechanism that reflects their preferences. So economic measures always run into those kinds of valuation difficulties. And then most of them are country-based. So that's one set of measures, the one way that economics has tried to measure sustainability. The other way is physical, and Professor Shorkar also mentioned footprint, the carbon footprint. So that's hectares of forest needed for storage of the carbon dioxide emissions that are implied by the country's consumption. How many hectares of forest do you need to store that? Right? This has the advantage of more accurately representing the pressure on the Earth's capacity by over-consuming countries, mostly the West, whose climate guilt, that is the pressure that they put on the Earth's carrying capacity, far exceeds the burden that they assume. So there's a disproportion between their consumption habits, that is, we can call it the climate guilt, and the burden that they're assuming in terms of foregoing consumption and so forth. And there are also ways of combining these indicators to form composites and so forth. So those are the two main ways of measuring sustainability. And economists mostly approach it from the point of view of pricing or taxing. So the policy implications that follow are that we set up a market for carbon trading where firms can pollute within limits as long as they have the particular carbon permits that they've bought in an open market for carbon trading, what's called cap and trade. That is to say, you put a cap or a limit on the total amount of carbon, and then you let the market work and companies trade with each other to buy permits for emitting a certain amount of carbon. Either that, or you can do direct taxation, depending on how much carbon different parties emit. But again, we come into the limitation where you need some form of valuation. How do you do pricing? Especially, how do you take into account the preferences of future generations? So when reasonable valuation techniques exist, they make sense, mostly on the pages of economics textbooks. But otherwise, it's not practical for us to take into account in this way, through the pricing and taxing mechanism, all of the consequences of our current consumption. As far as physical indicators, they do signal environmental damage, but most of them are country-based. And this is an important point. They're not linked to the incentive structures of economic processes, which are the primary drivers of environmental degradation. So they do a good job measuring the damage inflicted on the earth, but then there's no connection between the processes that do inflict that damage, which are mostly economic. So we have this gap between the economic indicators of sustainability and the physical indicators. And what we'd like ideally, because it's not that easy a job, is our indicators that capture the interaction between the two in such a way that we get advance warning when certain trajectories are non-sustainable, and also creating incentives for the economic processes so that we do have sustainable trajectories. Now, this gap, I would like to suggest, is a sort of symptom of failure at the institutional level. And this failure we can see all around. We have an upcoming climate summit in Glasgow. Prior to that, there was the climate summit in Madrid. You have the Davos meetings every year where all the business and economic elites get together. You have national climate negotiators meeting. The climate scientists issue their warnings, but we don't see any concrete action. So that's what I mean by institutional failure, that somehow, in spite of the general awareness that we're at the brink of a serious, irreversible planetary crisis, there just hasn't been the willingness to take the appropriate steps. Now, one of the issues that comes up here is, at what level do we tackle it? Do we tackle it at the level of the entire planet, which of course would make sense, or do we tackle it at the level of some subsystem? Now, let me just explain what we mean by that. So speaking of disaster, obviously global warming is not a disaster just like other disasters. So I like this quote from David Wallace Wells, who says, global warming is not just one input in an equation to determine the Earth's carrying capacity. It's the set of background conditions that contains within it all of the world's future problems and all of its possible solutions. So we can't just say global warming is just another disaster. It's sort of the meta disaster within which all these other disasters are unfolding. And if we don't tackle it at that level, then sooner or later, even if we're able to solve these isolated problems, they're going to surface in some other way. Now, another observation by Dipesh Chakravarty in a very well-known essay called The Climate of History, he says, the boundary conditions that work like parameters of human existence, such as the temperature zone in which the planet exists, are independent of capitalism or socialism. So what Dipesh Chakravarty is saying is that, in politics and in economics, we've been preoccupied with questions about capitalism, socialism, or some mixed market system, this and that. But he's saying this is the time to sort of step back and say that whether it's capitalism, socialism, and so on, it doesn't really make that much of a difference from a planetary standpoint. Because from that standpoint, it's the industrial civilization as such that has inflicted the damage. And whether it's capitalism or socialism is secondary to that. So that's the thrust of that essay. Now, we could say, well, capitalism, socialism are subsystems of a broader system that we could call the fossil fuel system or the industrial system. In short, the system, the economic system that was put into place after the Industrial Revolution. It took these two different forms, but essentially they're all subsystems. They're both subsystems of the of what we can call the industrial subsystem. So one of the questions, and I'm not answering this question, I'm just posing it as one that people have debated, is climate change to be tackled at the level of, let's say if you're a Marxist, is capitalism the main problem, and is it because of capitalism that climate issues have become so extreme? Or does it not matter what these systems are? Let's all get together because it's the fossil fuel system. So we need to tackle at that level and not really look for alternatives at the level of the economic system, right? So there's a bit of, I think the politics or the particular political view that comes into this question of, well, should we pay attention to the damage that capitalism is inflicting on the earth? Or is that a secondary question? And ultimately, it's a problem of the fossil fuel or industrial system, of which capitalism is just a subset. I'm just raising that question. So how does the economic subsystem relate to this larger system of planetary parameters? And again, the question is, it's no longer a matter of, the science is not there or people are not aware that this is serious. Everybody's aware of the gravity of the magnitude of the crisis. So why this unwillingness to take the steps that are needed to, and then this is after all in our own self-interest to survive as a species. And yet we don't see the same kind of willingness to take the kinds of steps that we should be taking, as we saw when you had the 2008 financial crisis and all the governments got on board to rescue the banks and so on. So there was a kind of urgency that was felt. Well, why don't we feel the same urgency when the very survival of the human race is at stake? We don't see that kind of immediate action, right? In the meantime, the US military has been planning for war scenarios under climate change. And so in this respect, it seems like the Pentagon is sort of ahead of, climate change groups and so forth. They're already preparing for the kinds of wars that they don't fight under climate change. Now, one of the best books I've read on this is by the novelist Amitav Ghosh. And this is a book which probably some of you have heard of. It's a nonfiction book. He's, of course, a novelist. But one of the lines that struck me from that book is, and he's referring to how Gandhi was very prescient in this matter. He says, the universalist premise of industrial civilization is a hoax. A consumerist mode of existence, if adopted by a sufficient number of people, would lead to the devouring of the planet. And he said that, even prior to all this climate science and so forth, people like Gandhi did have an intuition of what industrial civilization would eventually lead to. That the Earth does not have the carrying capacity to provide everyone on the planet with a middle-class standard of living without further destabilizing the planetary parametric conditions. So we can't have this innocence anymore that, globalization is eventually going to make the whole world, it's going to reshape the world in the image of the Western middle class. And that, this is a model that can be universalized. So there is a kind of conceptual deadlock that we're trapped into this kind of economic system where the main promise is that eventually we can all be middle class. And And if that's not possible, if that's a hoax, as Amitav Ghosh says, well, then of course the questions have to be posed at the level of the subsystem also, at the level of the what we can broadly call capitalism. Now, the way the economic system has responded is, by and large, what we call virtue signaling. That is, you have companies advertising that they're eco-friendly, and then there's a whole range of measures that we are enjoined to take at the level of the individual, right? We do recycling, we don't use plastic bags, we use LED bulbs, composting, solar wind energy, and so on and so forth. But the question is, often these forms of virtue signaling look good and they convey the impression that steps are being taken. But again, the question is, at the level of the crisis that we're facing, is that enough? Right? Is that enough, especially when at other levels, especially at the level of the economic system, the driving force is of increased prosperity and eventually this universalization of the middle class model. So if that's not achievable, then questions have to be raised at the level of the economic subsystem as well. Right? So a lot of the terms that we come across as sort of quick fixes to this, private-public partnerships, local cultural values, and this and that, they're simply not adequate to the magnitude of the crisis. And so we're hurtling towards this planetary catastrophe. And the question is, how do we see all these problems and disasters in their interconnectedness? So I want to turn quickly to just talking a little bit about the effects of globalization, and then I'll turn to what other kinds of concepts might we have to come to terms with this. So globalization, of course, in a standard kind of business or economic textbook, it's all about cross-border movement of goods and services, the theory of comparative advantage in international economics, which is supposed to bring about advantage to all trading partners because they all are tapping into their comparative advantage for trade and so on. But we also know that globalization has been accompanied by a whole series of other, what we could call side effects, but really concurrent transformations. Terrorisms, fundamentalisms, growth in the number of refugees. The latest one we saw was from Afghanistan. But there's a steady flow of refugees who've been uprooted because of armed conflicts, climatic changes, natural disasters, and so forth. Right. So every day there are boats drowning in the Mediterranean of immigrants or hopeful immigrants trying to reach Europe. The same thing is happening in the southern border of the U.S. and also the southern border of Mexico, where there are refugees from Haiti, from El Salvador, Honduras, and also apparently there are refugees from South Asia too. Refugees in the sense that they're looking for a better life. So India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. There's a resurgence of ethnic, racist, religious, anti-immigrant xenophobia. And of course, that's what Trump here was all about. We know similar things are happening in India as well. Prison populations are growing, urban gang warfare. I live about an hour and a half north of Chicago. And Chicago, every day there are shootings and 20, 30 people get killed. So it doesn't even make news anymore. And there's also intensified surveillance by governments and corporations. In addition, there's also this phenomenon of environmental apartheid where while the well-off can retreat into pristine landscapes, so in the US it may be the suburban areas, but those who can't afford it, they often end up living near landfills, chemical dumps, and so forth. So if you remember how, well, some of you are probably too young to remember, but Hurricane Katrina, when it hit New Orleans, which is the city in on the Gulf of Mexico in Louisiana in the south of the U.S., most of the actual flooding happened in the poorer areas where, poorer, mostly communities of color, blacks, Hispanics, and so forth lived. The affluent areas were by and large spared. So, and this is not an exception. We do see that it's the poorer, less well-off who are pushed into marshes, swamps, floodplains, and so forth. And even at the global level, there is a first world, third world divide where you have plastics, e-waste, used computers, mobile phones, all that sort of stuff is being shipped to third world countries because the advanced industrial countries don't want to be stuck with the detritus of industrial civilization. And here again, it's the poorest who are likely to suffer the most. So with all these consequences, I want to say that, it's not just an institutional failure. I mean, we can blame the World Bank or IMF for multinational corporations and so on. But yeah, of course, that's true. But it's also a crisis of the kinds of concepts that underpin the operations of businesses and corporations. So I want to say it's not just an institutional failure, it's also a conceptual failure. We simply don't have the kinds of concepts with which to understand these crises and disasters. Now, one of the major sets of concepts that we work with all the time is private and public, so much so that we've more or less naturalized it. Now, that this is private, this is public, and that is supposed to cover the entire domain, right? So essentially, the entire planet we've carved up into private and public, and at the nation-state level, of course, that's also happening. Now, but the thing is, these two words have a history, and this division actually occurred with the changes that accompanied the Enclosure Movement in England. So towards the 17th century, when there were still what used to be called commons or common lands, where farmers could go for grazing their cattle, for pastures, for collecting firewood and so forth, that even as late as the 17th century, these lands were held in common. They were not either private or public. And it's if you look at the philosophical underpinnings of these two terms, it turns out that John Locke is one of the first who theorized this. And basically he said, look, there are all these things in the commons, but if you go to the commons and you add your own labor to it, and so you're adding value by adding labor to something in the commons, that makes it yours as private. So in a way, it's sort of an early version of the labor theory of value, where, except, he's doing this mental experiment where he's asking, well, how did the commons become private? And he's offering a justification. He's saying, if you went and mixed your labor with it, then that becomes yours. And it's the state's public duty to protect that private right. Right? So the two words, private and public, emerge together. Now, that was when land was held in common, but I would argue that increasingly there are other domains which must also be thought in terms of the commons, that is to say, not private or public, but as a common inheritance of mankind, of humankind. So I'm listing a few contemporary domains that I think we need to think of in terms of the commons. The first, I think most would agree, commons of the earth, the resources, the minerals that are in the earth. Under the present arrangements, we all know that it's leading to overexploitation and massive environmental degradation. But there are also other forms of the commons. The biogenetic commons, so all the genetic information of flora, fauna, and so forth, they're also being converted into property rights. So they're being privatized, right? Our genetic information. The communicative commons. So all of the social and electronic media that we use, they're being privatized. We have a handful of tech firms. Google is the dominant portal to knowledge. Amazon, the dominant retailer. Facebook, social media. And these handful of firms are influencing social perceptions, consumption patterns, and electoral outcomes. There's also what I'd call the intimate commons, which is data on our individual behavior is being collected and sold to marketers. Now, those are private. They pertain to our private behavior, consumption behavior, and so forth. But in a way, those are part of our what we could call an intimate commons that ought not to be accessible to for marketing purposes. There's the commons of outer space. Outer space is being monetized and weaponized by big powers, littered with space debris. There's what we could call the social commons of humanity, where the estimates are that there are 6 billion people who are on the outside of globalization. So these are what you could call the losers of globalization. There are 1.5 billion who are sort of the winners who are on the inside. And the walls that separate the insiders from the outsiders, those have been springing up not only between nation states, but between middle-class colonies and the outside, more and more gated communities springing up. So all of these are introducing more and more distrust between religions, between ethnic groups, and so forth. So I think so far, the forms of property that we have, which is split into public and private, these are simply inadequate to come to terms with the commons nature of all of these domains, right? Of the earth, the genetic information, our communicative commons, the media through which we communicate, our intimate behavior, outer space, and in a way, the social commons of humanity, in the sense that the more and more we build walls, fortifications, borders, and so forth, there's going to be more increased distrust and less understanding of those who are on the outside. Right? So all of these are ripe for thinking of it as the commons. So these are the new enclosure movements. What the old enclosure movement, as I mentioned, had to do with fencing off the land and preventing commoners from taking their cattle to graze and so forth. But with these commons, we have a set of new enclosure movements that essentially want to privatize them or put them, when it comes to surveillance technologies, to put them under the purview of the state, and so on. So I want to say that, we all usually think of commons as only pertaining to land, but there's a whole series of these other domains that we also need to think of in terms of the commons. And there are new enclosure movements that want to privatize all of these domains, either privatize or hand it over to the state, which then uses its own technologies of surveillance. So how then are we to defend the planetary commons against the violence of these new enclosure movements? Are the concepts that I mentioned earlier on in the talk, disaster, sustainability, are they adequate to crisis, or should we develop a new set of concepts and institutions that are drawn from a different vision, that is a vision to safeguard the planetary commons? And of course, I would say that, yeah, it's time to think of new concepts that are more based in the commons, rooted in the idea of the commons, and then to think of how we can develop institutions that can be more true to those concepts or to the idea of the commons. Now, I want to turn, just to illustrate this, I want to take a little detour through the COVID-19. Now, COVID-19, we think of it as a medical emergency. And so, of course, the immediate need is to have the vaccine, get as many people vaccinated, and so on. And at one level, that's true. But it's also linked to the larger ecological crisis that I've been talking about so far. And I think this quote that I came across by Jane Goodall, who's a very renowned British primatologist who studied gorillas in the Congo. I think this quote kind of captures the essence of the link between the zoonotic diseases and the ecological crisis. And she says, because we destroy the forest, the different species of animals in the forest are forced into a proximity. So we cut down the forest, these species that live in the forest, they're forced to get closer and closer. And diseases are being passed from one animal to another. And then that second animal is then most likely to infect humans as it's forced into closer contact with humans. And so there's interspecies transmission of viruses already taking place because we've cut down the forests and so forth. In India, I know in my home state in Kerala, you have elephants now coming into fields, paddy fields and so forth, because there just isn't enough forest land for them. Or because of drought, they come looking for water into human settlements. So then you have a transmission of the virus to humans. And these animals there are also hunted for food, sold in meat markets, what are called wet markets in China, but also in other places. Then we have factory farming, where we crowd billions of animals around the world. And these are conditions that create an opportunity for viruses to jump across the species barrier to humans. And as we continue to destroy the natural world, we're actually stealing the future from our children. What's really nice about this quote, I think, is that it makes all these different connections. It says we have an ecological crisis that's linked to the spread of zoonotic diseases. And if we continue to do this, then we're stealing the future from future generations. So in other words, COVID-19 is not just a medical emergency. And when we contextualize this pandemic within the frame of the Anthropocene, although Goodall doesn't use that particular term, but essentially that's kind of what she's approaching it with. We can see its connection to sustainability and the planetary commons. So this is where I would like to turn to alternative concepts. So what other kinds of concepts may we have to come to terms with these crises? So I've tried to make the case that our present concepts are inadequate. Now, one theory that I've been drawn to is what's called the theory of assemblage. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. But even with the COVID crisis, I think we have to see it as an assemblage of natural, cultural, and economic processes. So there are all these processes happening, right? The ecological destruction, our food habits, where we go in search of these exotic wild animals, how that bridges the future for future generations. So we have a viral mechanism. There's factory farming where these animals are crowded together, industrialized agriculture, mega farms run by corporations, global economic development, international trade and transportation through which the virus spreads, cross-border migration. So there's a whole range of these phenomena that are occurring together, and these have to be understood as interrelated, but as moments within this meta-crisis that we call the Anthropocene. So increasingly analytically, this is our challenge, to how do we see all these problems in their interrelation with each other within the meta disaster, which we call the Anthropocene. So I want to quickly go over what exactly I mean by assemblage and why I think that might be a promising route to take. Now, this theory has been developed by this philosopher named Manuel Delanda, who draws from the French philosopher Gilles Deleuze's work. And I just summarize these four main points about what's so special about assemblages. So the first thing is assemblages are relational. They're arrangements of different entities linked together, but in a way that implies an autonomy from those relations. So you can think of it as sort of loosely related entities. So they don't have the coherence of a system. They're just sort of loosely related. And these produce new behaviors, new actors, new organizations. Assemblages are also heterogeneous. So there's a wide variety of entities that go into an assemblage. And there are no prior limits as to the entities that can be related. So this is, I think, the step that the assemblage theory takes. That is, you're trying to relate this is not human-centric, that's the first thing. And there are all kinds of things that constitute an assemblage, of which humans, animals, ideas, certainly. And there's no one dominant entity. So any kind of relevant entity has a place in the assemblage without the sort of domineering role of the human being. And the thing about assemblages is that they imply a dynamic of emergent forms. So you have these loosely linked entities, and they interact with each other in these non-predictable ways. And then there are these forms that emerge. There are partial objects that may hold together, but constantly mutate, transform, break up. So in a way, it's sort of like the Buddhist picture of what entities are like. But I think in a more specific way, that is, these entities are related. There are ideas in there. There are non-living objects. There are borderline organisms. So depending on what we're focusing on, an assemblage may contain all of these different things. And I think the theoretical step that has been taken in approaching an assemblage is that human beings are just one among what are called multiple actants. Now, the word actant is specific to assemblage theory, but they want to distinguish it from using a word like agent or actor. It's an actant is somebody whose role is much more limited in an assemblage, and an actant has to coexist with the multiplicity of other actants. And so properties emerge out of non-predictable encounters between these actants. There might be emergent phenomena that arise at the material level, or emergent behavior at the level of living creatures. And so if you want to use the older term agency, that's fine, but it cannot be conceived as human-centered, but as distributed across the entire socio-materialist ensemble of an assemblage. And this could be comprised of humans, animals, objects, ideas, and so forth. So just to make it a little concrete, How does this relate to the coronavirus? Now, there is some debate among biologists about whether a virus is even a living thing. We know it's a bundle of DNA, but can we call that life? Well, it's a borderline case, right? And there's no unanimity among biologists that it is in fact living. Now, there's a Yale physician named Nicholas Christakis who came out with one of the first books on the COVID-19, and the opening lines of the book are very striking, and I'd like to read that. It says, in late fall of 2019, an invisible virus that had been quietly evolving in bats for decades leaped in an instant to a human being at the Huanan seafood market in Wuhan, China. It was a chance event whose more subtle details we'll probably never know. Neither the person to whom the virus gravitated nor anyone else was fully aware of what had transpired. It was a tiny, imperceptible change. So from perspective of assemblage theory, we're talking about a tiny change by an invisible, we don't even know whether it's a life form or not. So it made this jump. And this jump occurred in a geographically specific assemblage, right? Which is the seafood market in Hunan and in Wuhan, where these exotic animals, civet cats and so forth. And we had something similar with SARS-1, right? It was also a zoonotic disease. But so we have all of the things that Jane Goodall mentioned. We have these wild animals being forced to coexist in greater proximity because of deforestation and so on. We have human cultural habits where there's a taste for these exotic wild animals. They bring them to the seafood market where there are other human beings. The virus makes the jump to a human being. So we need, no, it's an assemblage in the sense that it kind of implicates our place in nature. Right? The idea that we have the right to go and get these exotic animals, that they can be sort of traded as commodities in the seafood market. But it's not just that. It's, Americans like to blame Chinese food habits and so forth. That's not exactly what I'm saying. I'm saying that's an aspect of it, but it also calls into question our conception of our place in nature and all of the social and global relations. Those are also implicated. So it's not a matter of just blaming Chinese food habits. It has to be seen in this much larger context of deforestation, food habits, to be sure, the rights of animals, cross-border migration, traffic. Because a lot of these animals, some of them even are flown in from Africa into China, and so on. So that's one example where I think when you approach it from the standpoint of an assemblage, you start to see that you have our idea of nature, you have global relations, you have market relations, you have viruses. All of this is part of this assemblage. So I think, and this is a kind of personal attraction of mine, that I think this theory of assemblage promises new avenues of inquiry and research. So how does this affect epistemology, in the sense that how does it affect the way we go about studying things? So I think the big lesson of the Anthropocene is that humans no longer have the luxury of believing that they act on a reality which they can observe independent of their own entanglement with it. So, that's sort of the crux of the Anthropocene, that so far we thought the human beings are on this side, there's nature on that side. Nature is this big sponge that can absorb everything we do, all of our byproducts and so forth. But it's by and large independent of us. I think what assemblage theory pushes us towards is that humans have to take into account their inclusion in the reality that they're attempting to describe. So this is a step which, in a way, it's already been made in fields like quantum physics and so forth, but it hasn't really spread into other areas where you have to acknowledge that you're also included in that reality that you're attempting to describe through your knowledge, right? And in an assemblage, so in the assemblage in Wuhan, human beings are not dictating the terms, right? In a way, human beings thought that they were dictating the terms. All they had to do was bring in these exotic animals to this wet market, and then you can engage in transactions and so forth. But then, Christakis, as he puts it, there was this tiny imperceptible shift, a jump from this by this invisible, organism, which was completely outside the control of the other actants, right? So the virus was an actant, which we neglected. And if we acknowledge that the virus is also an actant in the assemblage, just like us, then we might be approaching some of these assemblages differently. So in other words, humans have to include themselves as one among the actants, even as they observe and describe that totality. So it's not a matter of humans not acknowledging their separateness. Of course, it's all mediated through human activity. And that's why one of the theorists of assemblage theory named Jane Bennett, she calls this careful anthropomorphization. So yes, we can't step out of our anthropomorphism, but let's be careful about it, she says. Let's at least try to include the effects of our own activities in the reality that we're studying. So that's, I think, a significant consequence as far as knowledge is concerned. Okay, so how does this all relate to the commons? Now, this is where I want to, I know there are always, anytime you move away from established frameworks, there's always the question, is it practical? Is it all pie in the sky? Is it just utopian? So I want to address that question a little bit. Now, of course, different forms of governance will have to be developed for these various commons domains that I listed, right? The genetic, biogenetic, the communicative, the social, the earth, and so forth. They're all different commons domains, and maybe we may have to invent different forms of governance for those. But we don't have to start with a blank slate, because after all, as I tried to argue, the ideas of private and public are fairly recent in human history. So before that, we have had collective experience in managing the commons. Now here I draw on this British writer, Guy Standing, who's a champion of this new commons theory. And he says that we can look back, for example, to something called the Charter of the Forest in England in 1217, which was a charter drawn up which enshrined the rights of commoners to access the forests for their means of production and subsistence. So this is well before the Enclosure Movement. And it had a provision for what were called stewards and gatekeepers. Stewards are vested with the responsibility of preserving and reproducing the commons, and gatekeepers act as a check on the stewards to ensure that the latter act in the intergenerational interests of commoners. So in other words, if we look back to the Charter of the Forest, they did have a governance mechanism. It was very rudimentary, but basically it said, look, we'll appoint stewards who will look after the preservation and make sure that the commons are reproduced, that there is no overgrazing, for instance, right, in pasture lands, and so forth. which was, there's a famous paper called The Tragedy of the Commons by Harding, where he says, commons are not really sustainable because then farmers are going to take their cattle and, the commons are going to be overgrazed. And so there's always this free rider problem that economists are so fond of. But Standing is saying, no, we don't. It doesn't have to be that. We have a successful charter that preserved the forests in England for a long, long time. And they had stewards who were in charge of the preservation. And then they also had gatekeepers who served as a check on the stewards. So they're the ones who maintained the intergenerational interests without succumbing to political or commercial pressure. Now, and I'm almost to the end. If Arpita, you're getting impatient, we're just a few more slides to go through. So intergenerational equity. This is really the has to be the touchstone of any reasonable concept of sustainability. So we have to have some kind of rule that needs to be adhered to. One of those rules is what's called the Hartwick rule. And this essentially says that the rental income from the extraction and use of exhaustible resources must be reinvested to the extent that it satisfies the principle that future generations benefit from the commons as much as the current generation. So this is a rule devised by the economist John Hartwig, who says, it's fine, you draw from the commons, but you reinvest so that future generations have the same opportunity sets as the current generation that draws from the commons. That's one kind of rule of intergenerational equity. And so it seems to me we almost have to have some kind of rule like that, which puts some limit on the consumption of present generations. So that, going back to the earlier idea of sustainability, that our resource stock in quality and quantity is passed on to future generations. So there's no reason why we could not come up with a similar framework of stewards who uphold the principle of intergenerational equity and gatekeepers who keep a check on them and who are insulated from political pressures. So I'm just drawing a very broad kind of framework and saying, look, the governance is not an insoluble problem. I think we need to be imaginative, but if we uphold the principle of intergenerational equity, then we can also come up with some forms of governing the commons. Now, another question that comes up, and now I'm almost to the end. Where are the revenues going to come from? Well, these commons are being used in such a way currently that the profits that are drawn from the commons, I mean, if you think of, let's say, Windows operating system, of course, it took some development in the early stages, but I mean, the marginal cost of adding an additional user to Windows is practically zero. And so there are similar domains like that, which where the marginal cost of an additional user is practically zero. But then people who have the property rights to those commons domains, they continue to extract profits and incomes and so forth from those domains. So why not impose, certainly levies can be imposed, taxes, levies on natural resources, but also levies on the legal and financial infrastructure, right? All these corporations are using social infrastructure, so why shouldn't they be taxed on that? On financial transactions, on the use of the electromagnetic spectrum, profits derived from marketing and use of personal data, and so on. So it's not as if, we could come up with a kind of collective trust by imposing such levies, which are essentially being now secured by parties from different commons domains, but the costs that they bear do not reflect the costs that they impose on the commons and future generations. So, I mean, in a way, it's a question of fair pricing, right? If you're drawing the benefits from the commons and you're imposing these costs on the commons and on future generations, then why shouldn't you pay the price, which is equivalent to the costs on the commoners, on commons, and future generations? So, in a way, you could, within the price mechanism, you could say it's a way of trying to make the price mechanism work better, right, so that it more accurately reflects the actual costs. Okay, finally, some concluding observations. So the main analytical challenge, I think, in developing a full-blown theory of the commons is how do we break away from this kind of, framework that we're imprisoned in, where we can only think of the market and the state, private, public. If these are the only two institutions, then I think, there isn't much hope for all of these other domains, because, the state will use it for its purposes of surveillance and rent extraction. It's practicable if parties that use the commons are taxed and they're forced to pay the levies for the advantages they reap from those commons. So that's the first thing. How do you break away from the market and state framework? Secondly, the idea of disaster. We have a disaster here, a disaster there, flooding in Kolkata, then you have drought in Uttar Pradesh, mudslides in Kerala, this and that, So right now we have a very kind of disjointed idea of disaster, and even the mechanism for what we call disaster response is so disconnected from various other disasters that are constantly unfolding. Even here we have on the West Coast forest fires, flooding in the East Coast, but how are the two connected? No, the government responds to the two disasters separately, right? They go and dump fire extinguishing powder on the forest fires, and here they have, rescuing people from floods and so forth. But there isn't a framework to see the connection between the two, and I think we need something like the Anthropocene and the idea of the commons to see that connection. Thirdly, I want to say what is our responsibility as educators? And sustainability has become this kind of buzzword where you always have a little chapter here or module there on sustainability. But that's simply not adequate. And so in that sense, I think that, of course, it's all about sustainability, but it doesn't convey the gravity of the crisis we're facing. And, the word has been used so much that it seems to not have the kind of import that it did when it first came into use. Also, Anthropocene awareness, which is my sort of overarching framework within which I've made this presentation, this is not a prerogative of one or two disciplines. The term itself was coined by a chemist. It's been taken up by geologists, or environmental scientists. But this is, it's not a matter of expertise in this or that field. It's something that cuts across all disciplines. And one of the things I'm trying to argue in my own university is that this awareness in different forms must be infused throughout the curriculum and across all disciplines. It's not like you go here and you take a course on environment and then that's it. We should all be forced to make the connections between what we teach and this planetary crisis that we're facing. And I think it would open up kinds of creative contributions on the part of students as well as those who do the teaching. And every aspect of the university's function should reflect this kind of awareness, including what the university, the kinds of buildings it builds, the kinds of investment it makes, in its trust and so forth. uh, every discipline and every aspect of the university's functioning, to my mind, should incorporate this awareness before it's. This is the need of the hour as educators, if we are to educate our students, to leave behind a habitable planet for future generations. I think I'm ready for questions.
Thank you so much, ROBY. I would request Prasishta, Professor Hyde, Professor Shorkar to moderate this question and answer session. And the participants, if you could please write your to deliver it to our speaker.
Oh, so I should also be looking.
We'll just collect up questions for you, and maybe we can give you the questions. But
Okay.
we'll just give our participants a few moments to write the questions. And Dr. Hyde, if you would like to, start with your questions, that way we can kind of get the session started.
Yeah, and I kind of approach as a discursive. I threw out some ideas which maybe some of you are not familiar with. So, and nor am I claiming that I have the solution to global warming or anything like that. But just to, in a kind of to live up to the provocation in my title.
Understanding what is actually happening in respect to climate change or environment or something like that, because we are so heavily burdened with just two-dimensional thinking, as you put it, the market and the state, and we all whatever is in our syllabus is related to that only. So that's why something actually preoccupied our mind, which is inflicted by on us by the syllabus itself. So don't you think something it is essential to change the syllabus entirely? I mean, though it is not possible for us, I know, but I find something very, very, which is happening. It is wrong. It is happening, and which is actually putting the entire human race at stake. I mean, not only human race, as you put forward, we must stop thinking ourselves as a superlative, and we are not superlative at all, as you clearly mentioned. So something wrong in our syllabus. So that's why we have failed to make our students and ourselves aware that what is actually happening and what may be the possible solution. As you put, we must think beyond the kind of mainstream thinking. You just exemplified that it is possible to think alternative. So solution is there. We can find solution. It may not so that whatever you are prescribing or you are suggesting or you are advising to some people it may not may not be acceptable, but at least we should start thinking that there is an alternative, and we could find it jointly, that alternative. So what about your thought regarding the framing of syllabus or some kind of thing? That is my little questions.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Hyde. I'm waging my own battle here in this university because, it's a problem here too. I mean, here we may have a little more leeway because the syllabus is not set at the university level. So, but we're stuck in this kind of disciplinary structure, and the kinds of things that I presented. If you go around the university and look at all the syllabi in all the courses, it's not really there in this way. Geology might mention now. About 3 years ago, I was talking to a colleague in geology, and he hadn't even heard of Anthropocene. this is not to blame him because, I mean, the kind of geological training he had, this was going on in some other discipline, So I think you put your finger on the critical point, but it's also related to the way we've carved up knowledge into, these disciplines. So this question about, what Anthropocene confronts us with, which is this division between humans acting on nature, if that's breaking down, then what are some alternative forms of knowledge which might arise by when we include ourselves in the assemblages that we study, So on the one hand, it's about the course content. On the other hand, it's also about the very approach to knowledge, And so I think, I'm approaching this COVID as a kind of teaching moment where I like to draw from this experience and say, look, you have the most advanced technological industrial civilization and so on. And this tiny little virus has wreaked so much havoc. How are we to reconcile what we do in our classrooms, in our, producing knowledge and so forth with this? How come nobody anticipated this? Now, strictly speaking, that's not true because the epidemiologists have been warning that a pandemic is imminent, because every 100 years or so, a pandemic like this does happen. But of course, nobody knew that this was the exact mechanism that it would happen through. But everybody, especially in epidemiology, which is a field, again, talking about disciplines. So that's a subfield of medicine, where they study the spread of diseases and so forth. So in that subfield, people were talking about the imminence of a pandemic because the last pandemic was the Spanish flu, which was back in 1914 or 18. So every 100 years or so, we know that this thing recurs. So in some small area of knowledge in epidemiology, they were fully aware that it's going to happen soon. But of course, that never spread the way disciplines are all carved up. That was never taken seriously by this field called disaster management. I've been looking into this field. Like, how come a field that is devoted entirely to the study of disaster, when I looked at the index in the back, there are all kinds of other disasters, mudslides and chemical accidents, oil spills, flooding, this and that. But, in the index, there's not a single mention of pandemic or even epidemic. Now, that's not because, people were not aware. It was happening. The epidemiologists were aware. They knew full well that the time has come. The pandemic is going to happen sooner or later. But the way that the knowledge system is organized, that was just some local field and local knowledge. And so we have a field called disaster management, entirely devoted to the study of disaster, not even knowing that a pandemic is imminent. So, the syllabi, but also the underlying kind of disciplinary structure of the university, where what happens in one domain has no bearing on what is going on somewhere else. So how can you be teaching about disaster management and not even, be faintly aware of the possibility of a pandemic? That's the kind of disconnect that this present disciplinary structure is perpetuating, So that I think that would be my response, that the syllabi, and I'm kind of waging a battle here to say, look, this is serious enough. This threatens our entire future as a species. How come you look through the economic syllabi or environmental syllabi or scientific syllabi? This awareness, which I'm calling Anthropocene awareness, you just don't see it reflected anywhere, And here we are facing the greatest crisis that humanity has ever faced. So something's seriously wrong with the way we organize our knowledge, And so I entirely agree with you, Professor Haidt. It's a huge struggle to take on the vested interests of these educational disciplines, and to have them kind of break down the barriers and communicate with each other. So that's what I would say.
Thanks, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
ম্যাডাম একটা কোয়েশ্চেন মানে আছে।
হ্যাঁ, ঠিক আছে। আমি কি স্যার একটু করে দিন না।
প্রফেসর বিশ্বনাথ মহাপাত্র থেকে, বিরসা মুন্ডা মেমোরিয়াল কলেজ, বাঁকুড়া। His question is, what immediate and long-time action should be taken by world leaders and politicians to create eco-friendly and happiness-indexed world after consultation with the academic world and scientists? This is a question from Professor Vishwanath Mahapatra from Birsa Munda Memorial College, Bankura.
Thank you, Professor Mahapatra. So in terms of action, I think often we rush to action thinking that we have all the concepts at our disposal and then it's just a matter of implementing them, But we have right now a framework for global governance, let's call it that, It's not called that, but implicitly you have nation states. So all of the political entities globally are organized as nation states. Then you have some multilateral organizations at the so-called global level, the IMF, World Bank, World Trade Organization, various scientific organizations. And interestingly, there are still parts of the earth that are still, if you want, held in common. For example, Antarctica. Nobody really, at least so far, nobody has planted a flag and claimed Antarctica yet. The oceans, outside of the nation states' territorial waters, the oceans are still held in common. So we do have still some surviving remnants of the common. But they're all fast disappearing because, as we know, the ocean is basically being used as a dumping ground, Just a couple of days ago, there was this report that, some whales, they, floated ashore, and then when they cut open the whales, they saw all this, plastic and all kinds of, human-produced junk in the stomachs of these whales. And, microplastics are spreading across the ocean in ways that we can't even see. So water bodies, we know this in India, right? Water bodies are essentially used as dumping grounds. We claim that, our rivers are sacred and this and that, but in practice, of course, it's just used as a drain. I know that that's true in my hometown of Trivandrum, There used to be these streams. Trivandrum is a hilly, very picturesque city, or used to be. But, they've covered up everything for construction, blocked off all the natural drains. And so every monsoon, Trivandrum is not a city that ever experienced flooding. But now every monsoon, all around the railway station, there's flooding, and there's just no place for the water to go. So even in just like in everyday practice, we disregard, in a way, what our traditional wisdom had preserved, the purity of the rivers, But now, with rivers being used as drains to dump garbage, they've essentially turned into sewers, So I think, the scale of the problem is so huge. So at the local level, I think there are these little practices that I don't want to minimize, the importance of using plastic or not throwing garbage into the rivers and so on. But all the way to looking for different kinds of governance systems and knowledge systems, So we have actual practices on the ground. I mean, this might be one way to think of it, is, there's construction, there's colonies coming up here and there, and especially Indian cities, there's just very little planning, especially environmental planning. So it's all this kind of so-called development. Then, so that there isn't even that kind of explicit reflection on what might happen if we pave this road, or if we block this stream, and so on. And then at the level of knowledge, I mean, I've already kind of tried to touch on all the shortcomings at the level of knowledge. And at the global level, there's this framework where we are relying on the nation state and these multilateral organizations. So at each one of those levels, I think we just need to go back to the drawing board, think of new concepts, new local practices. So the response has to be at multiple levels, I would say, at the level of local practices, at the level of knowledge, and at the planetary level, where we have to have different forms of global institutions. I have nothing against global institutions, but with COVID, we don't even have. I mean, there's the WHO, but it simply doesn't have the resources to act decisively and distribute vaccines in Africa and so on. Right? We have the organization in place, but essentially it's toothless. So maybe at the different levels, from the local all the way to the planetary, we need different kinds of responsive organizations, and we need different forms of knowledge. And I've tried to indicate that, the commons, we need to revive the idea of the commons. Perhaps this idea of the assemblage might be one way to take our study and of systems and so forth. So, yeah, I think it would have to be a kind of multi-pronged kind of response. There are too many vested interests that would like to kind of, block any kind of progress. So that's the other thing. Even at the university, I'm having to fight my battles with all the established disciplines. So that would be. Yeah, I don't have a practical answer, but I think the battle would have to be fought at these multiple levels: local practices, knowledge, new forms of knowledge, and also at the global level, perhaps different kinds of institutions. Maybe the whole nation-state framework is outdated. Even with COVID, we know that COVID spread across nation-state boundaries. COVID doesn't respect that kind of boundary, but our response is still stuck within the nation-state framework. So we have problems unfolding at a whole different level from what at the level at which we're responding. There's a huge gap there, and it's especially stark in the case of global warming. So.
Thank you, sir. Madam, your questions, please.
Well, okay. I have two questions which are very different. So maybe I'll just, go one by one instead of giving you both the questions together. The first one is, it's probably you have answered it, but maybe I'm just looking for another, reinforcement in my understanding.
Yeah.
That we do see that people are talking about global warming. People are saying that we are on the verge of very, large-scale danger, etc. It has become such a commonplace. Even my daughter, who's a little, kid, she even knows that okay, we have an environmental problem. We have a problem with the earth. That still, it just doesn't seem to register the scale that we are imposing on this earth. It's kind of, we are on the other side of the problem, and we are, as if we are watching the problem from outside. We are a part of the problem. That doesn't seem to register. I mean, I'm sure you probably have thought about, I would really like to understand a bit, if possible. Like, I mean, is this our myopia that we don't really want to see, or we cannot see what is going to happen after like a few years, or you know, in next generation? Or is it like we understand this problem, this global scale problem, as an apocalypse, that someday it will just unfold like a dramatic scene, like we see in a sci-fi movie, and we don't really understand it? We are already inside the problem. I mean, is it that kind of imagination that actually restricts us from understanding the scale of it? Or is it the fact that we actually see that this gradual progression of this problem that we have actually entered, this is actually affecting the poor people, the people who are marginalized, the people who are in the lower level of the social hierarchy? They are the ones who are getting affected first. So that is the reason why we are very comfortable with the hierarchy. That is why we don't really care. So these are the three things that come to my mind, that either we don't see, cannot see what is going to happen, or we're just waiting for something to happen, like a huge tsunami or something, some kind of life-changing thing that will happen overnight. Why is that? Why is that we see ourselves so much outside the problem?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. So on the one hand, especially within the past year with COVID and everything, you hear global warming practically every newscast, and even the popular media is connecting events like floods, droughts, and so forth to global warming. When they describe something, when you have a reporter describe something, and then towards the end they say it's all connected to global warming. So there's that kind of awareness is spreading. Now, the way I prefer to think of it, Arpita, is sort of psychologically. There's that famous psychologist who talked about the 7 stages, I think it is, of grief. So when there's a trauma that is so beyond one's comprehension, which is what a trauma is by definition, then the first stage is kind of denial, that, we've survived this far, or, it can't really be, maybe I'm just imagining it, things will go back to normal. This, so that one sees at the individual level too, that when there's a serious trauma, the first thing one wants to do is a kind of denial. And maybe something like that is happening at the collective level, where we kind of say all the right things, but it doesn't really sink in, is like what you're saying, But then I forget what the different stages are. But the next stage. So gradually, it's a kind of acceptance that even let's say at the death of a close relative, so in the beginning, the shock doesn't sink. It doesn't go. We're not ready to absorb the shock, and then gradually the reality sets in that it can't be denied. So you have denial, then there are some other stages, and then eventually acceptance. So I think the change has been so drastic that people are saying all the right things. They're mouthing words like global warming, this and that, but it hasn't really hit home. And I think maybe partly it's what you suggested, that people who are at the receiving end are usually not the ones who are admitted into these forums, right? Yeah, so you have, refugees from the Sahel trekking across the desert in Mali and, Tunisia, and then getting on a boat in Libya. These are people who've been displaced by droughts, conflicts, and so on. And the ones who take part in these institutions, they're not directly affected. So that may be part of it. That they see the scientific finding, they see the general consensus, but at the psychological level, I think it's sort of like a trauma. It has to really sink in before one can act. You do see increasingly, I mean, this is not something, I think Amitav Ghosh actually says this in his The Great Derangement, which is a lovely book, where he says, there are no more lifeboats for the rich, right? You can kind of retreat and retreat. So people in the US, for instance, they're retreating from the coast. They valued the water view and, big houses on the cliffs and so on. But increasingly with the oceans coming in, these houses are in danger. So they're kind of retreating further and further inland. But ultimately, whether you live in Santa Barbara or in a ghetto in Chicago, it's ultimately going to catch up with you. And so I think this strategy of retreating, once it stops working, once it catches up with these elites, then maybe they'll be shaken to their senses, So I kind of tend to think of it in that kind of psychological way, because often, even in our personal life, right, we may know that we have a certain bad habit, right? Smoking, let's say. Smoking is not good for health. Everybody knows that. But people continue to chain smoke. So what we know and our acceptance of the seriousness of it, there's always that gap, And so collectively, maybe that's what it is, And as it starts to encroach on, more and more privileged people and the richer countries, maybe it'll provoke some kind of response. But if, the classic example is these small islands, right, in the Pacific, right? Islands like Nauru and so on, where many of these islands have already become uninhabitable just in the last 10, 15 years, close to South Asia, the Maldives, some of the islands that comprise the Maldives are already sinking, The water level is rising, and they even had a conference. I don't know if you are aware. All the small island nations had a conference underwater to dramatize their plight, because many of these nations will become non-existent, especially these small nations in the South Pacific. And the Maldives and Lakshadweep and the Andaman Islands. In all these places, the water is rising. So, but these people don't, the gravity of the crisis hasn't quite percolated to the movers and shakers of the world. Right? So eventually, maybe it will when it strikes close to them. Until then, there'll be denial. They might say the right things, but like a addict who knows that this is bad, but is not able to bring himself to take the steps that are needed. That's how I think of it. Otherwise, if it's a serious enough issue and everybody is aware, then why don't we see? To some extent, it's also the inertia of the institutions, right? The whole governance framework that we have, and like Professor Haidt was saying, that we have the state, the market. When are we going to, get beyond all this and come up with a knowledge framework that's answers to the need of the moment? So So there's just the simple inertia on the one hand, and then a lack of concepts also. I mean, the business of assemblage, I kind of, in my reading, I thought, this is a nice framework, because it first of all, it removes the human being from a position of primacy, and then it gives place to things like ideas, virus, objects, various kinds of things. In fact, Bruno Latour, they may not use the word, but he gives an example of what is a state. We think of a state as unified, having a territory, and so on. But if you approach it from the standpoint of an assemblage, then it's a bunch of heterogeneous units. Ethnicities, races, tribes. I mean, in India, we know this fully well. Languages, castes, subcastes, this and that. It's this kind of heterogeneous bundle. And he says if we approach it in that kind of way as an assemblage of this loose kind of heterogeneous network, then we can also do two things. One, these entities can be decontextualized, so they're not stuck within that kind of one frame. And then they can be mobilized, or what he calls transfunctionalized, in a different kind of assemblage, So even something as, what we take for granted as the nation state, right? There's nothing natural about the nation state. The nation state is a European invention that happened, with the Treaty of Westphalia in the 1700s. So we haven't even been creative enough to come up with, alternatives to that institution. We just borrowed it straight from the Europeans, The Europeans are now kind of overcoming it through their European Union and so on. But in South Asia, we're still stuck with, India versus Pakistan. I mean, this kind of stupid rivalry.
We are still bothered about, we are still engaged with this question, who's the greater Deshbhakt? I mean, let alone the concept of Desh that we see today is so concocted and, manufactured.
Yeah. And the total, misuse of the word bhakt, actually. The word bhakt is, bhakti, you show devotion to, to some divinity through your karma and jnana, A nation is not something that deserves a bhakt, But anyway, that's, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I'm glad that you actually, talked about this concept assemblage again, because that's where my second question is. That's the last question I have. It's a fantastic concept. I would say it's so loose and so against this hierarchy that we are so comfortable with, and it's I don't know. I mean, pardon my audacity, but I was thinking that if this has got anything to do with the concept of moistry, karuna, moistry that we get from Buddhist ideas, it just seems so impossible living in this contemporary times. That idea of, assemblage defies all sorts of contracts, I would say, social contracts.
Yeah.
So this is just I don't know if that has got any. I mean, you said that had a connection with Deleuze, or where the concept came from. So that's what I was thinking. If we can actually safely say that there's some inspiration drawn from the Buddhist ideas.
Yeah. Well, I don't think that particular concept is directly, it came out of Deleuze's philosophy, and this guy Manuel de Landa has kind of highlighted that aspect of his philosophy. But I think it's like Amitav Ghosh said in his book. He said there's a famous statement by Gandhi who says, if India were to follow Europe in pursuing industrial civilization, then it would strip the world bare like locusts. So Now, this is not an insight that came from, environmental theory or anything, right? It came from a different knowledge source. And what you're suggesting, I mean, the idea of Maitri, for instance, right? And there's a whole other way that one can approach it, right? The Buddhist kind of thing is just in terms of its fluidity and its lack of rigidity. It kind of reminded me as I was reading it, because I think for me also, this is one of the great discoveries, of mine recently, that, okay, so this is another way, and it seems to explain things like COVID-19 or, how nation states get trapped into this idea of rigidity. And if we could just break it open and make it more fluid, even in, the case of India, Pakistan, I mean, there were trains that were going back and forth. People were crossing borders till 1965 almost. My wife is from Bangladesh. Her mother used to come to Kolkata to do her sari shopping, It was not uncommon. That was quite common. But gradually you see this kind of hardening of borders, and now they want to build a fence on the Bangladesh border. It's just the movement is even, for such proximate cultures as West Bengal and Bangladesh, it's become difficult. Because more and more barriers are being erected. So that was my idea of the attraction of an assemblage, and that somehow we need a way to kind of call out these rigid concepts like nation state, market, public, private. So commons that way kind of seems like a more open concept, and so yeah, I agree that there might be equivalent concepts in Indian traditions, which ultimately, even a word like moksha or nirvana and so on, it's about kind of giving up one's rigidities, right? And being a jiva mukti is to be liberated while living, right? So I'm sure I'm not an expert in Indian traditional categories, but people like Gandhi have approached and arrived at the same kind of insight through other means, and I'm sure we need in India probably people who are willing to do that kind of excavation, of knowledge categories, right?
Thanks, sir. We have one more question from Biman Dotto, is from our college, from Department of Botany. And he says, we know that all living things have intrinsic value, according to deep ecology. But my point of view is that still we remain in the concept of shallow ecology. That is for anthropocentric defense. Is there any way to apply the concept of deep ecology?
Yeah, I can't say that I'm familiar with the, I've heard of deep ecology, but if it's a way of moving away from anthropocentrism, then yeah, it comes close to, the idea of assemblage. But and not being familiar with that particular, idea, I don't quite know how close it is to the kinds of things that I'm saying. But ecology also has become a kind of specialized field of its own, and so it's become trapped in environmental science or something like that, and I guess what I'm advocating or pushing for is the spread of that kind of awareness, and perhaps deep ecology can supply that across various disciplines, and so that a concept like deep ecology is not kind of ghettoized within a certain narrow field called ecology, So that's kind of how I wanted to touch on the different measures of sustainability, because on the one hand, you have the economic measures, you have the physical measures, but the thing is, we don't have a way of connecting the two, because most of the environmental destruction is driven by economic processes, right? So all the incentives are economic, and that's what drives these processes. That's what creates this kind of destruction. So how then do we link up something like ecology or deep ecology with the main drivers of environmental destruction, which is economic? So I'm for kind of trying to find some way for these disciplines to talk to each other and to learn from each other. And there's something important that economics does teach us, which is that we have to set up the right incentives. That's one way to maybe summarize economics. So if the incentives are all for, if they're based on a divergence between the costs that are borne and the costs that are imposed on future generations and on the environment, then of course there's every incentive to take advantage of that, right? Because and at the collective level also, you have the advanced Western countries whose climate guilt, as I call them, far exceeds the climate burden that they've been willing to assume. Right? So part of the whole governance system has to be redesigned so that there isn't that divergence between the costs that are imposed on the commons and on future generations and the costs that these parties have to bear. So, so there's some creativity that has to happen, which cannot be purely thought of in sort of ecological terms, right? So there, I think ecology would have to talk to a discipline like economics and get enough people from economics to design alternative kind of governance systems. So that's how I would respond to that. Yeah, deep ecology. Yeah, thank you.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Continue, please, sir.
No. I was just saying I'm not that familiar with the deep ecology, so I don't know if that was satisfactory enough. But I think at some point the purely environmental ecological sciences would have to communicate with something like economics or the governance structures to make sure that the proper incentives are in place and that the trajectories are sustainable. So not just take piecemeal action now, but in the future, for future generations, is it sustainable? Yeah. So that's, thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Hello, Professor. Hello, may I ask some important
Yes, sir.
point?
Please, sir. Please, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Ravi Rajan, for your very nice presentation, very vast discussion regarding this topic on the human Homo sapiens as pathogens. You have mentioned that the COVID-19 as disaster and these disasters also linked to our ecological damages.
Yeah.
And ecological destruction also. So the COVID-19 is still continuing with us, and I hope that personally, my opinion is that it will continue. It will continue for a long period, and after that, it actually damages our health and economy on both sides. But after all, what will be the actual remedy that we may take, or any steps we may take in our educational system, that the students in future generation that you have mentioned in your concluding observation, that anthropocene awareness to be built in our curriculum in all discipline that you have mentioned. So how we will continue with this COVID-19 and also our education system that will continue in for the future generation, how it will be rebuilt. That means we want to know that as head of the institution and educationist, we have a big challenge in coming future, that education will run parallel with COVID-19, and then how we can continue with COVID-19, and then the future generation will prepare themselves or will accommodate accordingly with their new education system or new education policies. If you have that you have mentioned, please, if you add some important advice regarding this particular issue.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Sarkar. One way I've been trying to deal with it, I teach in a business department, and I teach there, quantitative operations kinds of courses. One of the courses I teach is operations management, which has to do with topics, with very mundane topics like, how do you lay out a facility? How do you measure reliability? How do you plan for capacity? How do you assure quality, and so on. So I am now teaching that course, and I've taught it the last 2 terms. But in the latest installment, I thought, because my question is always, how can I use this moment of COVID as a kind of teaching experience or teaching tool? So what I decided was, as I was going through each of the chapters, and it's all organized according to modules, that I'd have a parallel discussion which would ask them, I'd frame a question, and then I would ask them to relate that to the ongoing COVID pandemic. For example, we have a chapter called facilities layout, meaning how do you design a layout in a service facility or a factory so that processes, products flow through, and it maximizes, throughput, efficiency, and so on and so forth. So when I teach that particular module, in the parallel discussion, I give them a prompt. I say, look, when the epidemic first hit, it started spreading in certain kinds of facilities. Here you have these mega meat packing plants where animals are slaughtered, and they're packaged into meat to be sold in grocery stores. So that was one facility where COVID was spreading like crazy in the beginning. Another facility was the nursing homes for older people. So there again, COVID was spreading in poultry farms. So some of these places where COVID started spreading. So one of my prompts said, why did it start spreading in these kinds of places? Because there are certain characteristics of those places. First of all, these kinds of meat packing plants, they're usually staffed by minorities, a lot of Hispanic workers from Mexico. And so, this sort of goes back to what Orpita is saying. So, people were not paying attention to what was going on in these kinds of facilities. And so they weren't maintaining social distance. Workers were working right next to each other. They weren't being tested. So with the result that, COVID spread like wildfire in these meatpacking plants. And then the same sort of thing happened in the retirement homes where the older people live, because they need, service, frontline workers servicing them, so they need closer contact. So I tried to get them to show or to realize that, in a situation like a pandemic, the way you design your layout has serious implications, and the kind of people who work there. So if you're working in a tall building in the center of the city and your offices are all spread out, then you're relatively safe. If you're a Mexican worker working on the assembly line in a meatpacking plant where different workers are crowded together, you're much more likely to get COVID-19. So I take topics like that and I try to broaden them and to get them to make the connection between what's happening with the pandemic and what they're studying. So that has been my approach, and then I try to kind of broaden their awareness. I say, okay, so this is a disaster. Is it only a medical disaster? Why are we seeing this COVID happening and spreading all of a sudden? And then they say, well, yeah, it's medical at one level, but then how did it come? So then they're forced to go back to the origins and then say, okay, this is a zoonotic disease. How did that spread? So then, we talk about the layouts in these markets. That then leads to the question of environmental destruction, because how did this disease become zoonotic? How did the virus jump across the species barrier? So educationally, what I've tried to do is, I try to begin with where the students are. So whatever topic we're discussing, on the one hand, we do all the standard topics, but on the side, I force them to kind of, I give them prompts, and I want them to make the connections at different levels between COVID-19 and what they're studying. Yeah? And then that can gradually broaden out to, a much more expansive idea of what we mean by a disaster, why are all these disasters happening, how are we responding to it, and so on and so forth. Yeah? So I think educationally, and I'm trying to argue this with my administration here also, that we need to somehow make the connection, even if it's something like physics or chemistry, or that we somehow need to build in and get the students to make the connections. It may not always be obvious, but even in mathematics, so the word exponential suddenly became quite well known, but a lot of the students did not even know what exponential means. How is it different from linear? What's so dangerous about exponential? When we say this is spreading exponentially, and then you can use that to say, okay, this was the graph, and this is the data, and this is the rate of spread, and in the beginning it was this, and so on and so forth. So I think there are ways to make all kinds of connections between different disciplines and, all the information that has become available with COVID. Yeah. But that's just been my approach. I'm sure there are other approaches.
Thank you so much for your new ideas that will help us to continue our education in this COVID-19 situation. But I realize that we, the human beings, are responsible for spreading of COVID-19. At the same time, we have to manage the situation in this COVID-19 pandemic situation, how this education system will run with some modified or new concept, so that future generation will take some important for taking some to protect our environment, as well as some ecological disbalance or disaster that happened in the present system, in the present scenario. Okay, thank you so much for your valuable opinion and suggestions. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your question, Sharmila.
Dr. Banerjee, I think we have no more questions right now.
No, sir, I don't think so. So, I mean, the presentation in itself was so thought-provoking and kind of, it kind of opened some, concepts and some avenues where we have to think a lot. I mean, so it's not that something we have heard about already, kind of, and especially the scale I know after understanding the scale of this problem, it's probably it's a bit hard to really come up with the question that, unless you are directly a researcher into this area. So we are kind of we have asked all the questions we had. So.
Well, thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to, these are ideas. Some of them I've actually published about, but the part about the assemblage and the commons, that I actually put together in this presentation because I thought it would fit in quite nicely. So it gave me an opportunity also to kind of see whether they hang together. And I would like to thank Dr. Sharkar and Dr. Banerjee for this opportunity, and for all of you who were kind enough to attend my presentation. I hope and I value the discussions that followed from it, and I hope that we can all go back and try to make these structures a little less rigid and to make our knowledge systems a little more open and communicative between the different disciplines, so that we are able to leave, as I said, a habitable planet for future generations. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Now it's our turn to thank you. So Dr. Hayes will do that honor.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Professor Ravi Rajan. I know it's quite early in the morning, but still you took the trouble, and we are very much enlightened, and I'm very much grateful to you that you have participated and you have shared your views. So what I think you have repeatedly reminded us that it's time to behave properly, and it is time to come out of hubris that we often associated with our species. It's time to act and act collectively, and it's time to think beyond just institutional failure. It's time to respect other life forms and consider us as just one of the multiple equally important actors, as you have mentioned. It's time to have reminded that it is time to realize that we are not dictating the terms. We must take head on the mainstream thinking of considering the state and the market, and we must think beyond that. So it's quite encouraged. You have given us a lot of encouragement to think alternatively so that we can live together. Thank you, sir. Thank you for your illuminating lecture and sharing your views. Very often whatever we encounter or we find in our syllabus and around us, as Dr. Banerjee was saying, that people are realizing that something is wrong, but we are not acting. We are not acting. That is the problem, and you have reminded us not to behave like that. So thank you, sir. Thank you very much. And I would like to thank our principal, sir, Dr. Hariprasad Sharkar, from whom we repeatedly get encouragement to conduct such kind of webinar or web seminar, or where we can share our views and we can act together for building a better planet. And I would like to thank my colleague, Dr. Garhbeta Banerjee, and she took all the trouble to make this discussion so that we can have you, person like Professor Ravi Rajan over here. And I would like to thank Professor Uttam Sharkar, head of the Department of Geography, who also helped Dr. Banerjee a lot to make this event successful. We are thankful to all faculty members of Department of Geography and Department of Economics. We are thankful to our colleagues, and we are quite thankful to the participants who have shown their interest to actively participate in such a lively discussion. And I think it is beyond doubt that we got enough momentum to think beyond traditional line, and we will definitely act to make this world livable. Thanks once again to the participants. And above all, আমি আমাদের ছাত্রছাত্রীদের সবাইকে ধন্যবাদ দিতে চাই। তারাও মন দিয়ে এই আলোচনা শুনেছে। সকলকে ধন্যবাদ, এবং আমরা ভবিষ্যতে আরও যখন এই ধরনের আলোচনা সভা করব, সকলে তোমরা এখানে পার্টিসিপেট করবে, এই আমাদের আশা রইল। And once again, I would like to thank Professor RAJAN, and we hope we will again have you in the near future. And thank you, sir. And again, I would like to thank Praloy Bhattacharya for his technical support, Dr. Rajlakshmi Mukherjee for her advice and suggestions. And I'd like to thank, on behalf of Garhbeta College, all of you, sir. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you very much, Professor Haidt, for that lovely summary of what I was trying to communicate. And in conclusion, I would say, we as educators, we have our small domains where we can try to make small changes, introduce small changes in our own modest way. And so I hope we can all engage in that task together in the future also. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
So we come to the end of today's webinar, and once again, thank you to everybody, and all the post-webinar formalities will follow. Please check your emails. This is to all the participants, and thank you very much. I wish all of you a very good night, and ROBY, you have a very, very good day ahead.
Thank you, Arpita, and thank you for all the trouble you took to write emails and to arrange the times. We went back and forth on this to find a convenient date and time, and so, Arpita, thank you very much for all the trouble you took.
It was worth every while, I can say that. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Once again, I must thank Professor Ravi Ranjan for his for sparing his very valuable time with us in this morning, and then we are really delighted with your discussion, and all the participants are highly delighted for your valuable thoughts that you have presented in this through this webinar. Thank you so much, and thank you all for participating in this webinar. Thank you so much.
It was a privilege.
Thank you, sir.
তো আমরা কি এখানেই শেষ করলাম তো?
হ্যাঁ স্যার, আমরা আবার শেষ করলাম। We are ending the session.
So then I declare this meeting end here. Thank you so much.
Have a good night.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.